Okay, welcome, Vivek, to part two of our podcast on hunter-gatherer society and what it means for modern cultural evolution. So thanks for joining me a second time.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
And in part one, we covered the recent literature on hunter-gatherer society, and we examined the work of Christopher Boehm, elaborated by one of your mentors, Richard Wrangham, on hunter-gatherer societies, guarded egalitarianism. Why are they so egalitarian? And what we're going to do this time around, I'm going to give a little menu for part two here. First of all, we're going to introduce multi-level selection theory a little bit more formally, beginning with a tutorial, because our audience, I know, will be very diverse. And so we're going to relate hunter-gatherer society to multi-level selection theory. Then we're going to say more about what hunter-gatherer society tells us about our innate psychology, including our open-endedness, in addition to our what might be called genetically innate. Number three, we're going to introduce Eleanor Ostrom as a key figure, and we're going to relate her work to hunter-gatherer society in addition to modern groups. And then finally, we're going to discuss the relevance of hunter-gatherer society to modern democratic governance and its historical roots in liberalism. So that's quite an agenda here. So buckle your seatbelts, everybody. Here we go.
Yeah.
Um, Now, multi-level selection theory, if I could provide a tutorial, this is something that applies to the evolution of social behavior in any species, and we'll get to humans soon enough. But what it notes is that social interactions in all species take place in groups that are small compared to the total evolving population. So all populations, as far as the evolution of social behavior, are populations of groups in addition to populations of individuals. We must specify the groups in which the social interactions actually occur and the meta-population structure, the groups of groups that constitute the entire evolving population. And there's tremendous diversity in the um, meta populations. But when we focus at the most local scale, the groups whose members are actually interacting with each other, what we find are that the selection pressures are primarily in favor of what we would call disruptive self-serving behaviors, behaviors that benefit me, not you, another member of the group. And the reason for that, very foundationally, is that natural selection is based on relative fitness. It's based on individuals surviving and reproducing better than individuals. Inherently, it favors selfishness at this scale more than cooperation. And my example of that is a no-cost public good. Imagine that I can provide a benefit for everybody in my group, including myself, at no cost to myself. That's unrealistic, but just imagine that. And what we find is that if I'm in a group that consists of people like me and then other people who are not providing this public good, by the way I've constructed the example, there's no fitness differences. And natural selection requires fitness differences. So at a very foundational level, natural selection within groups is insensitive to the welfare of the groups. And so we must look to between group selection, some groups doing better than other groups, in order to find the basic evolutionary force favoring uh, cooperation. And that's true for all species, all species. Right. So no, so you might think that when we think of what takes place in many groups, especially human groups, where selfishness is punished by other members of the group or pro-social behaviors are rewarded. So these are within group processes that do punish selfish behavior and reward um, various forms of prosociality. But when we look at them in detail, what we find is almost invariably that these rewarding and punishing behaviors are themselves public goods. This is called second order public goods. And so in order to explain the whole arsenal of behaviors that cause groups to behave cooperatively, and those behaviors do operate within groups, we still need to rely upon between group selection in order to explain second order public goods in addition to first order public goods. So we don't escape the need for multi-level selection when we talk about such things as rewards and punishments. And
Mhm.
then another point to make is that um, typically when we study the evolution of social behaviors in any species, we do so on a trait by trait basis. So if, for example, if we're interested in warning calls, then there's a population structure for that behavior. If we were interested in like resource conservation, there'd be a population structure for that behavior. So there's not a single population structure for a species. There's many on a trait by trait basis. And my first contribution to the subject was to articulate the concept of a trait group.
Mhm.
We have to, which was just that
Yeah.
that concept. So it's against that background that if we apply this framework to hunter-gatherer society, we can see that when we focus on bands, for example, those are a unit, a group in which the social interactions are actually taking place. And so that's at a relatively small scale. But at the same time, those groups are nested within a larger population structure. And so the idea that interactions take place at a larger scale, it's required by multi-level selection theory to define what's going on at that scale. And so automatically, I think all along we were dealing with kind of a multi-scalar kind of a situation.
Right.
And also that there's many different kinds of groupings and things. Humans are capable of interacting in multiple groupings to an amazing extent. So the trade group concept more or less tells us that we're going to have to identify many different kinds of functional groupings. And it's against that background, for example, that if on occasion cooperation needs to take place at a certain scale, which requires hundreds of people rather than dozens of people. I know there's examples, for example, of indigenous societies with radically different social organizations at different seasons. And so during the winter season, for example, they might aggregate in hierarchical societies, and then during the hunting season, disaggregate into bands. This is all things that we can more or less expect from a multi-level evolutionary perspective. So I'm going to pass to you now. So having provided a tutorial for our audience, for you to just kind of expand upon that as to how this fits what we know about hunter-gatherer society and this question of scale.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I think that was a great introduction. And as you're kind of hinting at, human hunter-gatherers exhibit all the features of multi-level sociality. So maybe we can walk through uh, what the relevant units are. So at the core, you have sort of families that are premised on pair bonds, like husband and wife, for example, uh, cooperating to raise kids. Um, and by the way, this is all taking place within sort of a residential sort of camp unit, and so you'll have multiple families in a given band. Um, Within the band itself, you will also have kin clusters. So there's been some recent work showing that food is kind of shared preferentially within those kin clusters. And even within a small hunter-gatherer camp, you can actually have little neighborhoods of kin groups. So you have food shared within those kin groups, but then also more widely within the camp, and that camp is typically the residential band consisting of about 25 to 30 people. Um, in sort of the classic scheme, these people will move around a landscape together in relation to resource depletion, um, being near other bands and so on. But they really do function as an adaptive unit, and I've done a fair amount of work on this, including one paper I talked about in the last podcast that we did together. looking at the ecological determinants of of band movement, and we showed that actually pretty basic ecological principles explain why people decide to move from one patch to the other, and they're actually maximizing group level
Yeah,
fitness.
you use optimal foraging theory, and basically, which has been shown at the individual level in many species,
Right.
and you're showing that basically that the whole groups follow this in the case of the groups that you study, which was awesome.
Yeah, exactly. The marginal value theorem explains pretty well the timing of these camp movements, and so that further illustrated to me that this band is kind of interacting as an adaptive unit. A core part of that being that they have this common goal, right? Because they have to find food, exploit the local environment, and all the food is being shared. So they share a common goal, and that is kind of what leads toward this outcome. And we'll talk more about that later, probably.
Yeah.
But in addition to the band, you also have other kinds of relevant units, right? You have foraging units. So imagine a few men going out to hunt, women going out to gather, husbands and wives going out to go collect food resources as well. You have all sorts of kind of what we might call task groups that do activities related to foraging and subsistence and so on. And then kind of above that, or maybe in addition to that, you can also have groups that cut across different bands, right? Groups that might come together for religious or spiritual uh, purposes, right? Or to form other kinds of work groups, and this can be between bands. We will note that there has long been a recognition about fluidity between bands, meaning that people move back and forth between these bands a lot. It's sort of a well accepted trend that people will, um, like when there's a conflict, that you can just kind of vote with your feet, so to speak, and you leave one band and go to another. This is a way of settling conflict resolution. Although interestingly, there's been some work showing that this actually may not be quite as common as previously thought, which is kind of interesting. Um, and then above these groupings, you have the ethno-linguistic group. So again, this is kind of hierarchically organized. So many different bands are kind of combined into an ethno-linguistic group. They share a common identity and language, as the name
Yeah,
indicates.
so Vivek, let's just pause
Yeah,
here and ask the
sure.
question, how can there be I mean, for there to be an ethno-linguistic group, there must be some intermixing among those groups in order just to keep it as a recognizable linguistic and ethnographic unit. And that so say a little bit more about what are the kinds of interactions within group interactions, between group interactions, mixing between groups, which actually results in uh, something homogeneous enough so that they have a shared language and all the cultural practices embodied by that language.
Yeah, thanks for allowing me to clarify. Kind of building on our last conversation, if listeners have gone back to that, we talked a bit about how the band has really been the focus of anthropological research historically, and there's new work um, arguing that a lot of interactions go kind of above the band level. But as you're kind of hinting at, this would have been evident from the start, and it was evident going back to the famous Man the Hunter conference, which is a group of 25 to 30 people is not a demographically viable unit. You have to have exogamy, you have to have exchange, and then you have to ask, okay, what is the context in which that is occurring? Well, it's kind of what you're saying. It's exchange and interactions within the ethno linguistic group. So of course there'll be exchange for marriage, trade relations, right? Exchanging resources. A lot of work showing that this is a way that humans are especially good at buffering risk, in that you can kind of look far and wide for people to help you in times of need. And this is something that appears to be kind of uniquely human among the primates, is this ability to buffer risk at these really broad spatial scales, and having kin that maybe live far away, affines that live far away, but you can tap into these relationships, right? To kind of survive in difficult times. And then, of course, there's also warfare, which will largely occur between between ethno-linguistic groups, and this has been prominently illustrated in hunter-gatherer groups, especially those that were not unduly impacted by colonial contact. But historically, that would have likely been a reason that you um, had a certain band structure, and that would have definitely mediated the social organization in some kind of way. So those are some of the ways. Yeah.
Yeah, I've done a bit of reading. I'm an amateur anthropologist, but I remember reading about the Shuar
Hmm.
in South America, and pre-contact, how much warfare took place, and so much so that their houses were like little fortresses, so that people couldn't approach and poke spears through the through the houses. So, and I think you know better than me that in many cases, just a huge proportion of men dying violent deaths. Maybe you could elaborate on that, because there's a bit of a tendency in the modern literature to romanticize indigenous societies and to stress the cooperative and element, um, and downplay the conflictual element in between group interactions.
Yeah, well, there's been a huge amount of debate over the past couple decades about the prevalence of warfare in the human past, and it's a very sticky question. It's been highly polarized. Um, what scholars such as Richard Wrangham and Luke Lowacki would point to is that, as I was just saying, hunter-gatherer groups that have been less impacted by colonial contact tend to exhibit higher levels of warfare, suggesting that maybe this was kind of more of a modal pattern um, in uh, the past. You might also point toward the sort of in-group, out-group psychology that humans appear to innately have to some degree, as perhaps reflecting this history as well. We can also look to other primates, right? The chimpanzee model is kind of prominent. Of course, it's imperfect, but chimpanzees have patterns of conflict that are um, in many ways rather similar to human hunter-gatherers. So this suggests to me that it was probably a potent selective force um, in the past, but we can also accept that the the nature of intergroup relations would have been more diverse than what you see in chimpanzees, in the sense that you can have exchange and trade relationships as well. And of course, it's going to
Yeah.
all be conditioned by ecology.
Yeah, so I mean,
Yeah,
let me make that point, another
sure.
basic point about multi-level selection, that if we look at all I might have made this point in part one,
Mm,
if we look at all of the relationships that exist among biological species, we find this full range from violent competition to mutualism. That's the range we should expect among human groups. And so there's many forms of between group competition. Violent competition is one, but there's also imitation. There's just, you know, some groups hang together better than other groups without them interacting at all, like plants competing against the desert and all of that. So there's a huge range, and obviously, um, violent between group competition is part of the mix, but
hmm.
is not by any means the only form of between group interactions. And also, even when we consider something like the Iroquois Confederacy, then which actually did engage tribes in some kind of cooperative arrangement at a still larger scale, there was that yielded to between group competition again. So these confederacies, exactly as in Western societies, increased like the axial age. Now we have societies much larger than before. Some kind of social glue is holding these groups together at a much larger scale than before, but always in the context of competition at a still larger scale. And that must be true for all human societies, as far as
Hmm.
I could tell. That should be a generality as far as I can see.
Yeah, so the if you look at the archaeological record, we certainly see a kind of increase in um, violence, or at least the signatures of violence, as we go on through time. And so one idea has been that it's sort of agriculture and subsequent developments that kind of drove larger scale warfare. One thing I will note is I think this is a point of of unnecessary confusion, because um, even though the archaeological record is very thin on episodes of mass murder and so on before 10, 20,000 years ago, it doesn't mean that violent intergroup conflict was not important in human evolution, right? Um, because you can still have the threat that can condition psychological evolution um, without high levels of actual death. And in fact, if you look at small scale societies and how they fight, there's actually a very interesting clip from the Dani, this group in the highlands of New Guinea that was recorded in the early 1960s in this movie Dead Birds.
I've
Familiar
seen
with
it,
this?
yeah, a
Yeah.
long time ago, but I've seen it, yeah.
Yeah, but you might remember this very interesting scene of conflict where it's relatively large group of men from two different sides coming together, and there's not a lot of killing, but they kind of face off against each other in sort of this pitched battle. Um, uh, and then later on, there's kind of like an ambush, but it's not like you see in the movies where you have, someone riding on a horse into the front line of the other group and then everyone just killing each other. No, it was relatively equal sized groups. It was still a conflict, but the death toll wasn't very high. And this shows that, this is maybe how warfare was conducted in the past. So it was important, but maybe it wasn't resulting in mass casualty.
Well, we also have this shocking classic study. You can remind me of the author, Good Company, also in New Zealand, New Guinea.
Mm,
Um, Bruce Knopf, I think, was the name of the
hmm
author, and this was more internal, but it's just like every death, like natural death, was often interpreted as like sorcery or something like that, and would
Oh,
result in
yes.
another death. Um, and this would be internal. That's the degree to which the social control is taking place, and having what, to our eyes, is just like really pathological uh, uh, consequences. All, and I mean, Good Company. The title of the book is this is just part of the mechanisms of holding these groups together was a kind of social control, of which we'll get to
hmm
soon enough. And that was at the core of Bohm's hypothesis, the social control against bad behavior, which very often would misfire in these cases, so that what we would call a totally natural death, for example, from disease, would be interpreted as a form of sorcery and would result in another death, often from someone that wasn't fitting in well, or there was some other grievance or something like that. So it was almost as if the natural death had been had been used as a pretext for, and again, I'm the guy that's talking to the anthropologist, so you please elaborate on that as you see fit, because it's your field, not mine.
Well, I don't have much more to add on that. But but I will say, building on sort of this evolving conversation about good versus evil and war versus peace and human evolution, I would direct readers toward my colleague Luke Kowalski. He just had a few recent pieces, one in brain behavioral sciences on the evolution of peace, and then another one on um, I think it's an evolution of human behavior. It's called Apes, Foragers, and I forget the rest of the
Oh,
title,
great.
but these are sort of, I think, the best articles to look to understanding recent perspectives that really cut through this unnecessary dichotomy between peace and violence that we've seen in the literature for the past 30 years or so.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, one reason that I think these podcasts deserve to be widely viewed is because we are providing an update on on the recent literature on,
Right,
thanks
right.
to you, on hunter-gatherer society. I want to say a bit more about mechanisms of variation between groups, or the balance between levels of selection,
Sure.
before passing on to our next um, chapter here, because so often kin selection, genetic relatedness looms large in these discussions. And it's important to see genetic relatedness as one of several mechanisms that alter the balance between levels of um, of selection. And so other mechanisms include assortative interactions, the idea that basically that if you're in a group and there's some non-cooperators in the group. You can argue with your feet, as you've said. And
Hmm.
traditionally, group selection, it's been thought that dispersal migration between groups would make group selection less strong. But when it's conditional, it makes it more strong. And so assortative interactions, basically cooperators clustering together and avoiding the depredations of non-cooperators, is easily as powerful as kin selection as a mechanism for variation among groups. Then, of course, there's social control, the idea that punishments and rewards can be second order public goods that are often much less costly than the first order public goods. So um, that's a huge factor in um, in human evolution. Just ecological situations that make the benefits of cooperation far, far greater than the benefits of cheating. Is
Yeah, and I think that sort of assortativity, like cooperative assortativity you just mentioned, has actually been shown in hunter-gatherer groups through kind of field experiments where they basically show that cooperators end up kind of grouping together. So I think that is probably a pretty widespread phenomenon.
Yeah, yeah. And then finally, something which my colleague Terry Deacon uh, used the phrase symbolically eusocial, and that the social glue that holds human groups together is much less genetic relatedness, and it's more the fact that we're all members of a group are part of this symbolic system. They're just locked into it,
Yes.
and that's the social glue is our symbolic systems, which is very, very distinctively human. So against that background, the discovery that hunter-gatherer groups typically the level of genetic relatedness is quite low is no puzzle at all or no impediment at all to
Hmm.
these groups being potent adaptive units. So the idea that group selection is exceptionally strong in the case of human groups for these reasons, I think stands on a very strong foundation. Genetic relatedness is part of it, but there's so much more to what contributes to human groups functioning as adaptive units. Which is not to say that there's also not strong undercurrents of um, of selfishness within groups and so on
Sure.
and so forth. So this is why multi-level selection is needed in all of its complexity as a theoretical framework. Well,
Right.
anything you want to add to that before I proceed to chapter two of our conversation here?
Well, no, just to emphasize what you just said, which is, culture can often, evolve very quickly, and you can have big differences between groups, which can lay the foundation for group selection to be operating.
I guess another point to make is to appreciate both an intentional and a blind component to cultural evolution. That in some respects, people, including hunter-gatherers, are very mindful about what they're trying to do. They see things as clearly as you and I would, but that at another scale, often at a larger scale, then variation is just blind, and basically groups are structured the way they are. Nobody created it. And a great example of that that's been discussed by both Pete Richardson and Rob Boyd and myself is the Nuer conquest, the analysis of the Nuer and the Dinka,
Hmm.
and the degree to which the difference between them, the decisive difference, was basically their kinship systems. Nobody invented it, but just one. The Nuer were able to field a larger fighting force with their kinship structure than the Dinka. That just kind of emerged, and there was
Right.
not an intentional component to it at at all. And so to appreciate both an intentional component to cultural evolution and a blind component, that's kind of tough. I mean, it's just like the glass is half full, friends, half empty or half full, and we really have to appreciate um, both. Okay, well, now one
Actually, can
reason.
I just build on that for one
Oh,
moment? I
please,
don't know if
please,
this
please, yeah.
sort of
Now
moves up
we're
what we're
here
going to
for
say
as long
later,
as we
but
want to be.
yeah, well, so some of our recent work has examined the sort of functional benefits of consensus decision making, which is where kind of everyone has a voice and everyone has to buy into a band level decision in hunter gatherers. And one thing that struck me about this process is how aware people are of what they are actually doing. Um, and it turns out that they're much more aware of the association between social norms around deliberation and discussion and how they contribute to group functional benefits. They're much more aware of that than, say, we are in our society that's now highly polarized, and we see talking heads, shouting at each other, basically. Hunter-gatherer societies, when people are making decisions, it's very calm and calculated. They don't let one person bully the group and decide for everybody else. And I have written a paper, like I just said, based on the work of Megan Beasley, an ethnographer of the Kung in southern Africa. And she has some really awesome reports of people telling her explicitly, like, we want everyone to have a voice so that we are not led astray by a given individual, right? So they can see the threat of groupthink, they can see the threat of group polarization, and they're very aware of it. Um, again, I think that's an awareness that we could maybe tap into a little bit these days. But
I
that's just
think,
one area that sort of struck me when you're talking about unintentional versus intentional.
yeah, yeah. And Chris Bohm, who we cite again and again, has an
Mhm.
article, as you know, in which he searched the ethnographic literature for cases in which a group had an emergency and an anthropologist was present to describe what happened.
Right.
And the degree of structure and deliberativeness was just astonishing. And that's in part because I think that you know between group selection was taking place strongly enough. It was kind of a crucible that if groups fell apart when they didn't do it, and we're seeing the survivors of an intense group level selection process. And I think one reason that does not happen so much in modern life is that modern groups are not like the consequences of working well or poorly are much less extreme than in
Totally.
a hunter-gatherer society. So we know that when selection pressures are relaxed, like for example, some species ends up living in a cave where there's no light, then then your eyesight degrades, and pretty soon they become blind. And I think that's one reason why modern groups don't work as well as they do. Don't work very well often, is because the selection pressures have been relaxed, and so on and so forth.
Yeah,
So
I think you're right. I think there's a survivorship bias sort of in these reports, but there are still, I think, a fair amount of examples where you see how things kind of go wrong, where people move away from the kind of the sort of good design principles of how a group should operate, and then they fail. There's also other sources of evidence, right? I'm actually reading a new book by one of my favorite writers, David Grann, called The Wager, about a famous shipwreck in the 1700s. And th this group ended up failing. I mean, they faced horrible conditions, living on an island in freezing waters of Chile. Um, but it was fascinating to see how they sort of tried to band together, and they sort of did for a little while, and they had rules about non-domination and sharing, but then they were cheaters. People would steal the food, people would be domineering, and ultimately it was just a total disaster. So there are these other examples, right, of sort of disasters where people are put into situations of extreme ecological stress, kind of like you're indicating. And I think there is evidence that they kind of succeed or fail based on what kind of norms they institute
well,
in these
absolutely.
groups,
And
right?
just, Nicholas Christakis in his book Blueprint has a
Right.
big section on this. And Joe
Yeah.
Henrich, of course, as you know, loves
Yeah.
to talk about shipwrecks and so on. But if you
Exactly.
analyze them as as because enough of them took place, you can actually
Yeah.
do like a population level analysis.
Right.
Um, and what you find is that sometimes they work extraordinarily well. Other times they fall apart spectacularly.
Yeah.
And you can see the kind of the tension within and between group uh, taking place. But of course, that's a situation in which all of a sudden you're reduced to a single group. So as far as population structure is concerned, there's not multiple groups anymore for the moment. There's just that one,
Yeah,
right?
that's true. Yeah,
And
yeah,
then and so the temptation to cheat and so on. So not good conditions for that, but a wonderful sort of natural experiment.
yeah,
Well,
exactly.
one when the recent papers that you've shown me that are emphasizing the fact that cooperation take often takes place at a larger scale um, than small bands wandering the landscape
Hmm.
are see themselves as are written as critiques of evolutionary psychology. And I think as these critiques are expressed or described, it's just like, well, evolutionary psychologists have more or less portrayed human evolution as taking place only at this small scale. And then that means large scale interactions or some kind of genetic mismatch that has to be solved by cultural evolution. And so these new discoveries that larger scale cooperation extends further back in human history than that story told is kind of a new insight. Part
Right.
of me thinks that that's maybe some straw man are being constructed there from the very beginning, but maybe I could ask you to just relate that theme and that we can talk for a period of time on what we mean by human nature. On the one hand, we have the school of thought, evolutionary psychology, which placed a large emphasis on genetic evolution, massive modularity, and so on. And then we have the cultural evolution school, which places an emphasis on much more open-ended um, flexibility. And so speak to me on that theme, and then I'll chip in here and there.
Yeah, sure. Um, Yeah, so like we talked about in the last conversation, some of these papers are kind of framed around the idea that evolutionary psychology has talked about humans as being adapted to very small groups. Now, I think in the last conversation, I presented some other kinds of critiques or some thoughts of those recent papers, and just in the sense that we've kind of known for a long time since that hunter-gatherers live in multi-level societies, and therefore there's interactions at different levels, different kinds of different functional units. Now, so one question then is, it has evolutionary psychology indeed spoken about human evolution um, in those terms? I'm more of a human behavioral ecologist, so I keep up with the EvPsych a little bit, but maybe not as much as I should. But my first sort of response might be um, that some of the modules that have been hypothesized uh, would potentially work at any of these scales, right? That's kind of my first knee-jerk reaction. Um, cheater detection mechanisms. There might be an argument that this focus on kin is misguided, but again, people do interact a lot with their kin. So I don't know. I'm not sure, frankly. What was your initial um, reaction?
Well, I make an analogy with the immune
Yeah.
system and its two components, the innate component, which is massively modular and
Hmm.
does not change during the lifetime of the individual, and then the adaptive component, which is all about the selection and variation and selection of antibodies. And if you take that whole package and you think of that for the human behavioral system, then I
Right.
think you get a nice combination of evolutionary psychology and its massive modularity, these modules which don't change during the lifetime of the individual, and something like the adaptive component of the immune system, which is like the Skinnerian um, standard social science model side of things, in which, to many extent, we vary and we're reinforced with what works. Those go together in the immune system. Why don't they go together, and why shouldn't they go together in the human behavioral um, system. But I think that so for me, that's a beautiful resolution, and I just wish, and I
Right.
think that over the period of decades, now we're talking, the 1990s when these ideas were first being formulated, and now it's 2025, so it's a third of a century has gone by the
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
I wish it could be faster, but that I think is a perfectly good resolution. At the end of the day, I think, so when we talk about moral psychology, um, and um, and this uh, the elements of guarded egalitarianism. First of all, a kind of a stubborn individualism, where the individual is not passive, is not
Hmm.
just some kind of certainly the strong sense of individuality that somehow combines with a strong sense of communality. And
Right.
so the idea that nobody's the boss of me, you can't boss me around. And at the same time, extreme fruit. I mean, speak to me about that because it seems like the opposites go together. There's a kind of a yin and a yang. On the one hand, a real insistence on individual agency. And on
Yeah.
the other hand, a willingness to be part of something larger than oneself. That's the magic combination. That's what gets put together in a highly cooperative group. So anything you can say about that? I mean,
Yeah.
talk about opposites coexisting. I mean, it's just wonderful and very important for
Yeah.
us to get clear.
No, it is, and this is like one of these really amazing features of these egalitarian societies that a lot of anthropologists think characterized a lot of human evolution, is these traits that to us living in kind of modern industrialized society we think of as being opposite, right? So people are highly autonomous and um, uh, individually appreciated. So you can't boss people around, you can't tell them what to do, you can't have people work for you, right? There's all sorts of social controls that make this not possible. And so if you just see that observation, you might think, well, then people are just kind of doing their own thing. But you do have this other layer to it, which you're mentioning is interdependence, right? High levels um, of cooperation. So you can do what you want with your day, but at the end, you're still expected to contribute to the group. You go and get an antelope, you bring it back, and it essentially belongs uh, to the group, and it gets kind of shared out um, widely. So, these seem on the face of it to be kind of contradictory. In our recent paper, I think we provide one possible sort of resolution to this, which is that I think that the egalitarian ethos goes beyond, it may be grounded in, but I think its function goes beyond simply not wanting to be dominated and having a norm that fights against that. I think what it is doing is that egalitarianism in groups is potentially is group level adaptation that encourages social norms that might enhance group level um, performance, basically. And so in our paper, we talk about this as facilitating information flow. So when you have a group decision being made, the egalitarian ethos demands that everyone has an opinion. Everyone's opinion is equally valid. And what that means from an information processing standpoint is that you're getting more diverse information about a situation. It's not just one or two people deciding based on their what would benefit them personally, but it's the whole group that is coming together to make a decision with all this
Yeah, let me expand
information, right?
upon that,
Sure,
Vivek,
yeah.
because I think that, I mean, the cheater cooperator dichotomy only goes so far. And I think
Hmm.
that what what goes farther, much farther, is the idea that this group is such a cooperative unit that it has all these processes. It has to have like an anatomy, a physiology. It has to have cognition. This is so much mechanistically, so much more complicated than just cooperating or or cheating. And everything that we associate with cognition and typically think of it
Mm.
too individualistically. Perception, memory, decision making, everything cognitive is turns out to be a social um, process, and the same kind of complexity that we take for granted with individual organisms and their various processes and organs and so on and so forth. Something like that
Hmm.
is going to have to exist at the group level if the group, in fact, is a highly cooperative unit. I think that's what you're alluding to. Is that correct? I mean, I think I'm making your point, but
Yeah, exactly. So, we're arguing that egalitarianism is a way of maximizing collective intelligence by allowing diversity of thought, people coming. Well, here's another thing too, is that when it comes to autonomy, is that people it's almost insisted upon that you come to your own decision, right? Um, you're faced with the information, but you as an individual are kind of granted, it's demanded that you have your own opinion about things. You're not just saying what the guy next to you says. Like there's so many examples of the corporate boardroom where the boss gives their opinion at the beginning and then everyone else just follows along, right? Because there's this power dynamic. In egalitarian societies, you have social norms that arrest that power dynamic, right? They kind of short circuit it. So you have everyone giving their opinion. And so when we talk about the voice kind of at the back of the room who has kind of an interesting idea, but they're not, willing to speak up. Well, in hunter-gatherer societies, they kind of have this circle where you kind of go around and everyone gives their opinion. So that quiet person in the back with the good idea, they're actually able to express that idea. And maybe that contains the solution
and the
to a
wise
problem.
leader. I mean, sometimes these societies do have a bit of hierarchy, but
Sure.
the
Yeah.
wise leader, the chief or the wise leader, withholds his opinion throughout most of the process and is really functioning as more of a moderator of processes. Then I think this is another
100%.
good example of analogy. Um, us organisms have concentrations of neurons, we call them brains or ganglions or things like that. You could have concentrations in human groups, we call them leaders or chiefs or something like that, but very often they're functioning in the same capacity as aggregators and so on and so forth, at least in the cases where those work well. And some work on, like, if we just go from decision making to memory and the
Hmm.
concept of distributed memory,
Yeah.
uh, there's a whole set of things there. I wasn't
Yeah.
anticipating doing this, Vivek, but I want to
Yeah.
go in the direction of spirituality here.
Oh, sure.
And the reason is that when we look at the whole mindset associated with religion and spirituality, and it featuring such things as the concept of the sacred, and the word sacred and also the word worship have secular meanings in addition to religious meanings. Basically, when you regard something as sacred, you place it above yourself. You regard it as more important than yourself. You want to serve it. You want to subordinate yourself to it. That's voluntary on your part. And I think that whole package that we associate with spirituality and religion can be thought of as the psychology of being part of something larger than yourself, the psychology of being embedded in a highly cooperative group. And so my question to you is, to what extent is that mentality with sacred worship, the subordination, kind of the
Hmm.
willingness to serve, basically, um, is that present in hunter-gatherer uh, society?
It's a good question. I have to say I haven't looked at that really uh, specifically, but I will say that there are um, social norms around the processes that we were just talking about that are ultimately embedded in these belief systems and oftentimes have consequences that might have a spiritual nature to them. Like if you don't share food with somebody, that person, I'm talking about like the Malaysian case
Yeah.
of the groups I work in, but I think this applies more broadly as well. Then the person who needs the food will basically get sick, and then you, as the non-sharer, will be at fault for that, right? So, and then there's other examples as well in these sort of animistic groups uh, that that I work with in Malaysia where you do see yeah, like the thunder god will send a storm or something like that if you don't behave sort of
Yeah.
properly,
Yeah.
right? So I think we see over and again that there is some kind of supernatural element to the potential punishments that could result
Supernatural
from this.
punishment. So that, I mean, and
Exactly.
there's a whole literature on that with big gods and so on. You know,
Yeah, exactly.
some years back, I was reading the famous play, The Doll's House by Ibsen, the
Yeah,
Norwegian playwright.
yeah.
And in that play, the woman has a moral failing,
Hmm.
um, and the husband immediately tries to isolate her from her children because the belief then in 19th century Norwegian society was that, you know, moral failings were contagious like a disease.
Oh,
And so I think that mechanism was operating in European society just as strongly as indigenous societies, very, very strongly.
oh,
So much
fascinating.
so much to talk about. Well, let me
Yeah,
uh, move on to chapter 3 here and introduce Eleanor Ostrom.
sure.
And once again, in a kind of a tutorial way, but something that is very much connected. So she was a political scientist by training, and she studied the famous tragedy of the commons, the tendency of groups managing common pool resources to exploit the resource. That's what cheating takes
Hmm.
the form of. Um, and what she showed against economic wisdom was that some groups are capable of avoiding the tragedy of the commons. In other words, they're capable of self-governing, but
Hmm.
only if they implemented certain core design principles. And so she was awarded the Nobel Prize in economics in 2009 for identifying these core design principles for self-governance, basically in a certain kind of group, common pool resource groups. And I worked with her for 3 years prior to her death. And what we did was we generalized the core design principles and we showed that they actually apply to all cooperative endeavors. And in multi-level selection terms, groups that implement these core design principles are like a miniature major evolutionary transitions. What these principles do is they suppress the potential for disruptive within group competition,
Right.
and they turn the group into a highly cooperative unit. And so, and much of my work, we test the hypothesis that these principles are so general that they apply to all cooperative endeavors. We have articles on that with modern groups. And what I'm eager to do with you is to see how well these principles apply to hunter-gatherer groups. And we might even
Hmm.
think of hunter-gatherers as the original Astromian groups. And, um,
I love it.
and so Ostrom is this is brings us to the what I've often fondly referred to as the archipelago of beliefs and of knowledge and practice. And so when the academic world is so siloed, basically, that somebody can be totally famous in one discipline and
Hmm.
unknown beyond its borders. And so we were chatting beforehand, and Ostrom is pretty well known in the evolutionary community, but you were saying not so much as far as your training was concerned, and that's very, you know, that's usually the case is that people who should know about Ostrom don't. So in a minute, I'll um, I'll zip through these core design principles, and we could relate them not necessarily one by one, but to what's the fit
Sure.
with hunter-gatherer groups. But say a little bit about the presence and absence of Ostrom in your own graduate training, and then I'll zip through the core design principles.
Yeah, well, I'm kind of embarrassed to say I wasn't too familiar with her work until relatively um, recently, and you know, in reading about her, I learned that even in the field of economics, she maybe wasn't all that well recognized, and
No, not at
I
all.
think
She was the like the biggest
that,
outlier ever to
right,
receive the Nobel
yeah,
Prize.
yeah, which is fantastic. I think that's really great. But you know, as I've as I've arrived at my own kind of way of thinking about how groups operate and group level kind of adaptations, it seems highly relevant. And as you know, as a scientist, it's always so fun to kind of discover what you've been thinking and saying, but in a different domain, and to see kind of overlaps and new applications. And I think this is exciting for me because this is one of those cases.
Well, exciting for me because this is what I do when I'm working with business groups and
Hmm.
schools and any kind of group. Now we get to do this for hunter-gatherer groups. So here I'm going to quickly zip through them and we'll
Sure.
provide a link to our audience. So here are the 8 core design principles for groups to self-govern. Number one, shared identity and purpose. The group must know that it's a group, what it's supposed to do, who's a member. So on strong sense of identity and purpose is actually probably the most important principle because it basically defines the group and its membership. Number two, equitable distribution of contributions and benefits. Not sustainable for some members to do the work and for other members to get the benefit. There must be some sense in which what you get from the group is proportional to what you give. Number three, fair and inclusive decision making. Decision making should include everyone in the group for 2 reasons. One is to share their wisdom, and in the second, to avoid unfairness, basically. And you've worked extensively on decision making, so we'll touch upon that for
Sure.
sure. Number four, monitoring of agreed upon behaviors. There must be a sense in which we know whether or not we're doing what we've agreed upon to do. Number five, graduated responding to helpful and unhelpful behaviors. If you're not doing what you should, there needs to be corrected. Doesn't have to be mean spirited or harsh at the beginning. Friendly reminders are often good enough, but it also must be possible to escalate, even to the point of capital punishment, as we know from
Hmm.
our friend Richard um, Wrangham. Number seven, authority to, number six, fast and fair conflict resolution. Conflicts will occur and they need to be resolved in a manner that's regarded as fair by all parties. In a dispute, most people think they have a reasonable point of view. Number seven, authority to self-govern. You can't govern yourself if you're being dictated from outside your borders. So there must be some local autonomy, basically, so you can govern yourself. And then number eight, collaborative relations with other groups. So the same principles that apply to within group interactions also need to apply to between group interactions if those interactions are going to be cooperative. And so
Right.
what this says is that the core design principles are scale independent. They're needed to govern between group relations no less than within group relations. And that's why we can apply these principles to, for example, international governance in addition to the smallest of groups. And that's a tremendous conceptual simplification. So, with
Hmm.
apologies for the brevity of that, I'm now eager to know to discuss what kind of fit does that provide with a hunter-gatherer, with a hunter-gatherer band, let us say the primary economic unit of a
Sure.
hunter-gatherer society.
Yeah, well, I think the fit is pretty good. And before I go into the details, I will note in our recent study, I actually surveyed the social psychology literature about what makes effective groups, and I'm realizing now that I don't think I saw Ostrom's name anywhere in that literature. And I know, and I was actually inspired by one of your book chapters from I think almost 30 years ago, where you talked about the literature in industrialized organization and social
Right.
psychology as providing a nice testing ground for some of these ideas. And so as we talk about this, I might bring in some of those examples, but to cut to the punchline, it's basically the same stuff, just kind of different terminology, different field.
Yeah.
Um, groups
Yeah.
groups have successful groups have certain ways of operating, and there's conditions for them to operate well. So with that in mind, if we just start at the beginning in terms of clearly defined boundaries, a shared purpose, we've talked about Chris Bowen before, this idea of moral communities, of let's say bands recognizing themselves as a unit, as an adaptive unit, essentially, that lives or dies uh, as a group, basically. This is how they conceive of themselves. And this provides the conditions so that people have a shared interest in whatever the outcome is, you know, surviving, finding the right water hole, finding the right hunting ground, things like that. And this is kind of automatically uh, going to kind of dampen these between individual differences in the group. Because if I try and push a group to go to a place with better hunting for me personally, well, I have to share the food anyway, so you know, I should make a decision that benefits the whole group, right? Um, in terms of clearly defined boundaries, going back to what we talked about earlier, we do have ethnic identities, ethno-linguistic groups, but there is also clear identities in a sense to lower level units, like let's say a household, a kin group, right? A family. People recognize these. The band level, or maybe sort of cross-cutting religious groups across bands, right?
Well,
Um,
in one of the
yeah.
papers you assigned me, and you can mention the authors. I think we mentioned them in part one as well. There were hearth groups and foraging groups, and so the hearth group was one unit. The foraging group was another unit. Those are the ones that went out to forage for food. And in this particular case, the food sharing arrangement was restricted to the foraging group, so did not extend to the hearth group.
Hmm.
The hearth group cooperated in other ways and had its own sub structure. So this brings us back to this like polycentric, many different work units basically, and the ability to recognize the context basically. So each one of these contexts basically had its own set of rules, and people found it easy enough to apply the appropriate set of rules depending on the context. That's how good we are at participating in multiple groupings, and for the norms of each one to evolve somewhat separately from each other.
Yeah, exactly. And as you have pointed out in your articles that you pointed out now, it's very context dependent, right? So when we talk about the seasonal rounds of the Eskimo or the Inuit, which is like this long-standing example of social flexibility, there's more hierarchy during one time of year when you have kind of a larger aggregation. But you know, this may be a more useful way of doing things because maybe you need a little bit more centralized control, for example. And there's many examples of that from the hunter-gatherer and the kind of broader small-scale society um, literature. So I think we have to appreciate the fair amount of flexibility even within societies to adapt these rules to ecological conditions and depending on what sort of the goal is, right, of that current situation.
Yeah, so let's proceed to
Sure.
equitable distribution of contributions and benefits. And is it the case that people are more or less acutely aware of such things as free riding and so on and so forth? Just speak to me about the sense in which there's a strong set of mechanisms so that to ensure a proportionality of costs and contributions and benefits.
Yeah, well, this is sort of the classic anthropological terrain, right? Of, you know, norms of food sharing. Everyone kind of gets a share. Um, where when it comes to, let's say, hunting, you know, who gets credit for it? Sometimes it's the person who owns the arrow rather than the person who shot the animal. So I think what's interesting about this case is that, you know, especially in the cases of these nomadic egalitarian groups, is that you can accrue status, right? You can accrue prestige based on being a good hunter or a capable leader, um, and so on. But sometimes the benefits can be not as evident as in other situations, right? Where you're not accumulating all these goods, right? And items. There's social control kind of um, against that. So I think that's kind of it. Like I wouldn't say it serves as a counterexample to that. It just shows that there's kind of a different manifestation of it. And then on the side of punishment, of course, there's, you know, relatively tight social control on people acting badly, people being people being bullies. Many examples of this in ethnographic literature that I think we
And also this
have
idea of
encountered.
graduated sanctions where, it starts
Yeah.
out, humor is a huge part of it. So, I mean,
Hmm.
you could tell many stories I know about leveling basically based on
Right.
and humor, and then getting more and more serious with exclusion and even execution. So the concept of graduated sanctions, and also I think
Mm.
rewards for positive behavior. So I think that the fact that if you are exceptionally useful in a group, then that is rewarded with status. So it's not as if it's just equal shares all the time, not at all.
No. Right,
And
right.
that's especially true reproductively.
Yeah.
That the best hunters often have the most kids, and I remember one study. I actually wrote a um, this View of Life article on it. The best
Mm.
storytellers have the most kids. So being a good storyteller
Oh, right. Yeah.
is highly prized,
Hmm.
basically, and rewarded, basically, reproductive rewards. And the groups with the best storytellers were the most cooperative groups. So storytelling and cooperation, there's an important link link there.
Yeah,
And if you look at
that's a fun
myths,
one.
you find, the myths have very familiar uh, structure with violations and restoration of social norms.
Right.
Is the stuff of myths.
Yeah,
So
exactly. Yeah, yeah. Those are fun examples. And kind of as you indicated, there is kind of a well-known finding that better hunters have higher reproductive success. It's actually not totally clear why. There's actually a number of mechanisms that could lead to that. But even within the most egalitarian groups, there is still some kind of benefit to being good at certain things, to being particularly useful, even though, as I said, it may not manifest in exactly the same way we see in our society with
that's no
extreme
argument at
inequality.
all against. I mean, the
Yeah,
status,
exactly.
status is. I mean, Joe Henrich's work on
Yeah.
reputation is, yeah. I mean, that's huge incentive to work hard.
Hmm.
The whole difference between power and reputation is basically power taken versus power earned.
Exactly.
Um,
Prestige versus
so
dominance. Yeah.
yeah, so these are
Yeah.
all what we would expect. I remember the novel Things Fall Apart
Hmm.
by Chinua Achebe. The protagonist of that novel was this was I forget whether it's Uganda or I think it was um, but what was so striking was how ambitious he was. He had been born, I think he was an orphan or something. So he didn't have any, but because he was so hardworking, he had built up a good reputation, and now he was a somebody in his tribe. But it was just like as strong a status oriented society as a Western society, basically incentivizing
Sure.
hard work on behalf of the tribe, so that there was something super familiar about about that, but just what you'd expect in terms of graduated responding to helpful behavior in addition to sanctions
Right.
against helpful behavior.
Yeah. Can I give two ethnographic examples
Of
that I think
course,
might
yeah. The more
illuminate this?
stories we tell around this, the better.
Yeah, so one is in a sense like the exact opposite of what you just said, but I find it to be just a fascinating example where I mean we know that in small scale societies that being a hard worker is valued. It's valued in a mate, it's valued in a camp mate, and so on. But it turns out that there is it can actually go too extreme and it can actually work against the egalitarian ethos. So the ethnographer Jerome Lewis has a great report of something he saw among the Mbengele, a group in the Congo Basin, where there was one guy in the group who really loved to hunt. So he went hunting all the time, and after a while, people thought that he was actually hunting too much. He was almost inappropriately using it to accrue status, and he was a good hunter, so he was bringing back food. But people told him like you're doing a little bit too much of this. This is inappropriate. But he kept on doing it, and so he eventually got ostracized. This guy who was bringing in all this food got ostracized because he was working more than he should have been, which was interpreted as himself kind of taking a position over others. And so to me, that
Okay.
shows that, I mean, it can go the other way as well, right?
Well, it's like a lot of company cultures where if you got some good little doobie
Yeah, yeah,
in
there
a
you go.
business.
And my other example of graduating sanctions, like I said, I've been studying collective decision making and kind of the micro norms around it. And one report from the anthropologist George Silberbauer was that there was one guy who was being a bit of a bully. He was orating. He was like shouting at the camp about what they should do, what he thought that they should do. Now, people don't get up then and start shouting against him, right? They didn't turn it into a confrontation. They basically just turned their backs, and one person just kind of imagined a thorn in their foot. They said, "Oh, look at this thorn," and he started looking at the thorn, and you know, so he basically stopped paying attention. Another woman went and like started cooking, um, and so it really shows that it's not confrontation that might result sometimes, but just ignoring the person, and that kind of
Yeah.
shows that we're not buying into your BS.
Yeah. Well,
So
that
that's a
I
form
think
of
is the
graduated sanctions. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. Now we could talk a long time. I know decision making you've worked extensively on, and I think for the purposes of this conversation, we could say, oh, right, man, oh man, is decision making the third core design principle, fair and inclusive decision making, is like a polished stone in terms of many hunter-gatherer groups. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's right. And in your article, you talk about kind of consensus building. Like I said, I just worked on an article that's up on uh, OSF as a preprint. But we basically examine the kind of adaptive benefits of consensus decision making, which is what you'd expect, where you basically get everybody to buy in. You can't just bully someone around. But we argue that it leads to essentially more collective intelligence, and I kind of outlined a bit of that earlier in the conversation. I'd encourage um, listeners to check out. I wrote a popular piece on Eon called the Junquanxi Protocol, which is essentially looking at ethnographic reports focused on the Junquanxi or the Kung about how they make consensus decisions and all of the again the micro norms and behaviors that go into this and how it results in making a quote unquote good uh, decision. So there's actually some kind of functional benefit to consensus. It's not just this feel good thing that people
Yeah.
do. And part of the way that we start this out is that um, I think for a long time there's a legacy in social sciences from groupthink to by Irving Janis to the law of group polarization, the idea of Cass Sunstein that if you put a deliberating group together, they actually become more extreme if they share
Yeah.
similar beliefs from the start. And what I argue is, well, let's look at real life groups. Let's look at how they
Yeah.
behave. And actually, consensus building is not synonymous with conformity at all.
Yeah. I know it.
It, it all depends on the context. And as you have argued, as I argue now, humans are kind of predisposed to behaving really effectively in small groups. It's totally opposite of what Janice says. He points to the Bay of Pigs or the Challenger disaster, these failures of industrialized organization and hierarchy, essentially. But this isn't unique, or this isn't uh, a human trait. These are examples that are limited to a very small subset of circumstances.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
we've both written on this, and I mean
Right.
the concept of groupthink is deeply problematic and has been shown to be
Hmm.
for a long, long
Hmm.
time. And some of the worst
Sure.
examples of groupthink were examples of when you look at them, like Lyndon Johnson basically was a domineering man, and if someone disagreed with him, he'd stand and he'd put his arm around him and say, "Someone's losing his effectiveness," and
Right, right,
so we could think of Trump as being quite a bit like that. And so that's
right.
definitely not a group working well, but not because it's a group.
Yep,
It needs to be more of a group and so on and so forth. So
totally.
I want to say a little about monitoring because one point to make is that these core design principles, in some to an extent, come for free, like monitoring. If you're a band and everyone's just there, then it's hard to do something and have it be unmonitored. So some of these core design principles just kind of come for free by nature of the groups, but not
Mhm.
entirely. And in the case of monitoring, the literature that I've read is there's additional norms about, for example, being alone and so on and so forth that actually increase monitoring above and beyond what comes for free. Do you have a comment to make about that in terms of take monitoring as one of our core design principles?
Sure, yeah. Well, kind of recently I've been thinking about hunter-gatherers or small-scale groups almost as surveillance states, minus the state, of course. Right, where and this is kind of grounded in my own personal experience. Again, I'll never be part of this society, but I've lived long enough with these groups to kind of briefly be a part of them during field work. And what you notice is that there's no behavior that goes unnoticed. In my recent work, that we talk about even the camp structure of hunter-gatherer groups is disposed toward kind of monitoring what everybody is doing. You know what food is coming into camp. You have these open structures arranged in a circle. And so whether it's things related to subsistence, related to social relationships, to who's cooperating with whom, who's getting in a fight with whom, all of this is kind of being monitored and subject to these norms that we've talked about around reward and and punishment. And when you see certain hunter-gatherer groups get exposed to the outside or to adopt sort of outsider ways of life, and something as simple as getting stone houses that are no longer open, you see a breakdown of these norms. And I've seen this in the societies that I work with, where you can't tell what food people have. They're going to the shop, they're buying, tin cans that they can hide away. And these can help to contribute to a breakdown of their more traditional social
And they're
system.
not slow to do that. So I think one point to make is that if you do
Yeah,
relax the structure in one way,
right.
human nature is quick to shift into, cheater mode or whatever. Uh,
100%.
so it's not as if you selected that out. Yeah, and I think in some ways to the Western imagination, it seems like, not a pleasant kind of society to be surveillance to that degree. And also emotional regulation. I know that including
Hmm.
the people that you study is something where the expression of emotions is highly kind of governed as well. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, one of the famous ethnographies by Gene Briggs, Never in Anger, this talks about norms against anger among Inuit. But it's a pretty common pattern. I've recently written about this again as a way of avoiding a disastrous decision, right? You don't want to make decisions when you're kind of hot-headed. This can be bad. So I actually documented some norms among a variety of societies where um, if there is kind of a heated argument, there's actually a norm where it's like, okay, we have to stop the discussion now, and we'll come back to it later. But even not just anger, but there's often social norms uh, prohibiting even strong expressions of emotion at all, right?
Yeah, that's
Um,
the one.
yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, when I'm out living in the jungle, you'll see amazing animals, birds, butterflies, and so on. But I quickly learned that to even what they might call dwelling on something, if I say, "Oh my gosh, look at that."
yeah,
Butterfly with this amazing coloration, it's pretending to be a leaf or whatever. They say, don't say that. That's dangerous, right? It's kind of dwell on nature, and this goes back to your earlier point you made about kind of the link with the supernatural. So yeah, so I think one common pattern among ethnographers is noting kind of like the stoical nature of a lot of these groups, and I think as we're talking about, it might actually have some kinds of benefits, right?
yeah.
Yeah,
That's a very different kind of yeah. We're emphasizing cultural diversity here. There's some sense in
indeed.
which we're talking about principles that are culturally universal, but the outputs, just as with biological evolution, evolutionary theory is completely general, and every species is unique. And so we have, principles of cultural evolution, multi-level selection, completely general. Every culture is unique and super different from other cultures. We need to be prepared to have things really quite alien from our own way of thinking, despite the fact that they're all outcomes of these evolutionary processes. So it's a fascinating combination
Totally.
of general and specific. All right, final chapter. This has been
Sure.
so awesome to get this, and that has to do with basically the relevance of hunter-gatherer societies to modern day democracies and the principle of liberalism. And let me just quote from the Wikipedia entry on liberalism. Love how Wikipedia has become like one of the most trusted sources of information. There's a whole story to be had there, by the way.
Indeed.
I have a wonderful podcast with a senior volunteer of Wikipedia titled Wikipedia as Superorganism. So
Right.
all of these same principles applied to Wikipedia. In
Yeah.
any case, liberalism is a political and moral philosophy based on the rights of the individual, liberty, consent of the governed, political equality, the right to private property, and equality before the law. Liberals espouse various and often mutually warring views depending on their understanding of these principles, but generally support private property, market economies, individual rights, including civil rights and human rights, liberal democracy, secularism, rule of law, political freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, so on and so forth. This is attributed to John Locke as someone as
Hmm.
an initiator. Um, and and figures such as John Stuart Mill and Alexis Tocqueville, who are all trying to talk about this emerging system of modern democracy and grounding it in their conception of human nature. And a quote that I love from Tocqueville is the village or township is the only association which is so perfectly natural that wherever a number of men are collected, it seems to constitute itself. So there was Tocqueville
Love
from
that.
France
Yeah.
looking at the American democratic experiment. Both of these are large scale societies, making this comment about small scale society as the only association which is so perfectly natural that wherever a number of men are collected, it seems to constitute the naturalness of small scale society. And so I think it would be very impactful and actually needed because if you read the recent literature on liberal democracies, what you find is, first of all, it's endangered. So you go back only a few decades, and it's seen with books like Francis Fukuyama, The End of History, that liberal democracies have won, basically. This is
Right.
shortly, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's just like there's only one thing that's left, liberal democracies. And now
Right.
today, it's just like so shocking that liberal democracies are so endangered by collapse on the one hand, authoritarianism on on the other hand. And it's just like, how do we rebuild the foundation of what we're talking about with liberal democratic governance? And I think if we could come in at this juncture and we could provide the best of our current knowledge about human evolution in general, starting with hunter-gatherer society, that's a pretty big deal as far as modern political theory is concerned. And so what are your thoughts on how would you update Tocqueville's statement about the village or the township constituting itself? What would you say about
Yeah.
this?
Well, I think everything we've talked about in these past two conversations help to answer this question, which is that I'm sort of stunned at the amazing capacity for humans to survive in small groups that are highly interdependent, that share a common goal, basically. And what we see in the ethnographic record is a diversity of social organizations and systems that can help to solve collective problems. And it often occurs in this multi-level this multi-level context. When you look at, when did democracy emerge? It's always a conversation that starts with Athens, right? But what we see now is that the very idea of a democracy, it goes way, way, way farther back. And we see all sorts of manifestations of it in hunter-gatherer societies and other, what we might call small-scale societies or indigenous societies. There's a really nice literature emerging on examples of early democracy in the Americas, um, that I think is worth tapping into. But they there's many examples, like whether it's the Iroquois Confederacy, or there's like the Muskogee. There's many others, in which you have these multi-level societies that um, show a lot of the design features that we've been talking about during our conversation. There's a very famous book on democracy by, I think it's Robert Dahl, called On Democracy. And I was kind of interested, okay, what does he have to say about pre-Athens? And the answer is a single paragraph that basically just says that so-called primitive democracies were animated by a logic of equality. And I think that is true as far as it goes, but I was amazed at how little interest there is by mainstream social scientists and political scientists in non-Athenian forms of democracy. But we have to look to these to understand how ecology and cultural history has conditioned social organization across time. And I think what we're arriving at is a picture of amazing complexity, but at the same time, uh, they're kind of united by these core design principles like we've been talking about.
Yeah, and I think we can this is I think a nice conclusion.
Hmm.
We're coming to a nice conclusion of part two that so much has to do with scale, a
Hmm.
theme of both of our conversations. And at the smallest scale, then I think we can find that there is something that we can call human nature, which looks a lot like liberal democracy, basically individual rights, basically, and individuals insisting on their say, their agency, but that actually contributing to a very to a very strong cooperative group at a small scale.
Small
So that
scale.
yin
Yeah.
and yang that we're talking about of individual agency and a society that works well, leading to a society that works, integral to a society that works well, I think is the core of the idea of liberalism. And we could provide a very strong foundation for that, a genetic and cultural evolutionary foundation for that at a small scale. Then we
Right.
come to scaling up. And what we find is that scaling up has taken place in indigenous societies, stretching back further than we might have thought
Yeah.
before. And so we have many examples of the scaling up to consider. Certainly did not begin with Athens, although Athens is a super interesting case. And
It
I have another
is. Yeah.
conversation with an Athenian scholar on that we can link to. And now we have our current efforts to scale up. So Vivek, there's one thing on this list for liberalism which really kind of sticks out um, as private property. And that's something which actually is not a part of the hunter-gatherer story. So isn't that interesting? I think that, and so I think that bears quite a lot of thought as to, I mean, private property might well be important in a modern context, but it's not something that goes back into deep time the way the rest of the kind of the package of individualism and communalism does. So that's something very interesting to think about. And my
Hmm.
co-author on my article with Eleanor Ostrom, Michael Cox, has a very interesting book on property in general, the whole concept of property. Property, even in a modern context, is seldom private in terms of it's always very often owned by collectives. And so there's a lot to be said about property that's that's part of this. Well, I think the general take-home message, and I think one reason why I'm so happy to have had this pair of conversations with you is that these ideas are foundational to the concept of liberal democracy. And so I think it does provide um, the strong foundation that many people are saying are lacking, especially during these challenging times. So I look forward to sharing our conversation in that sector, along with many other um, sectors. So thank you so much for all that you're doing, and I look forward to continuing to work with you.
Thank you. This has been really exciting.